Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Kivlin, curator at Art Foundation. And thank you to Samantha and Margaret and everyone at the Frick for this amazing afternoon. It's a fantastic topic and obviously one we're all eager to learn more about in this panel. When we were structuring the panel, we were really thinking about ways to sort of discuss the nuances of contemporary work that has been created for, with, or on the land, and also uses the greater environment as its context for its reception. Often the maintenance of this work has many stewards, of course, the artists themselves, as well as private landowners, or even from state and government entities to the greater public. But a focus today is to highlight the complex origins of support for this work, and also how it carries with it a history that mirrors the priorities of collecting during that time, as we actually just heard in the previous two talks. These visionary artist projects called for forms of alternative support and patronage, and without them, they would have not been realized, most often because of their scale or scope or ambition. Although it can't be overlooked, for instance, that there were select artists that often received such support, and they were often men, and they had easier time, of course, than, say, women, who often had to self-fund or rely on commissions or grants to realize these projects. Early support of this work also gives focus to the pioneering collectors during that time, as we also just heard. Despite the unruly or tenuous nature of this work and given its precarious locations and context, collectors, as we heard, like Robert Scull and Virginia Dwan, which we're going to hear from James more about, as well as organizations like Art Foundation and many others, were really looking to give voice to a generation who are choosing to depart from the gallery or the museum to realize this work in a landscape that was both unruly, as I mentioned, but also quite bold, and required various forms of support in terms of the travel and the materials, as Alexis had outlined. So James will be speaking Virginia Dwan and her impact as a pioneering gallerist, first in Los Angeles from 1959 to 67, and then in New York from 1965 to 71. But she was also a very pivotal figure, not only in the development of post-war art, but also as a celebrated visionary and the patron of the arts in terms of her work, in terms of supporting, rather, Earthworks themselves. Of course, we've already discussed Heiser's Double Negative in City, as well as the first version of Di Maria's Lightning Field in Arizona, Ross's Star Axis, and of course, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which Dia is obviously the owner and steward of today and since 1999. James's talk will be followed by a conversation with myself and the artist Michelle Stewart. Since the 1960s, Michelle Stewart has created a multifaceted body of work that shifts between large-scale earthworks, collage, drawings, photography, and sculpture. She has been devoted to recording and studying the traces upon the earth, whether by nature or by human hand. In our conversation, we'll give focus to her early work, as well as the forms of support that were available to her throughout her career. And last, we'll be hearing from the art conservator Rosa Lowinger from RLA Conservation of Art and Architecture, who will speak to the specificities of conservation related to works that are subject to the exterior factors and whose condition is always changing due to the complex attributes of the natural elements and obviously our changing climate. We look forward to hearing your questions on all of these topics, which will follow a discussion with the panelists. Thank you again, and please join me in welcoming James Meyer.
Hello, everyone. I bring the regrets of Ms. Dwan. She's very sorry she can't be here this afternoon. She was very excited to come. She's lived across the park at 72nd and Central Park West for the past 50-something years and recently moved up Fifth Avenue, and this is her neighborhood, and she loves the Frick, and there's no place she'd rather be than here with us, and so she sends her regrets. I did organize, as you heard, an exhibition about the Dwan Gallery history, and while there's absolutely nothing as interesting as hearing Virginia talk about her history and about her artists, and to hear her passion about her accomplishments with them and her patronage, I will do my best to bring us through this history, and I will do so in a way that contextualizes some of the themes of this session, this panel. historically. I wanted to make a few points for us to think about this question of the uncollectible that Samantha has raised. The uncollectible is in a kind of relationship with the collectible. This is not a new problem in the late 60s and 70s with land art. It's a modernist topos, the idea of what is collectible and uncollectible, what is wanted and what is unwanted, and how does something go from one side of things to the other. How does Manet in the early 60s or Monet in the 1870s or Matisse in 1905, how does something that is unwanted become wanted? How does it become commodified? How does it enter collections and museums and so on? Is an old topos of modernism. And one could say that the 60s and the 70s, our period for this session, is, if you will, the last moment of the uncollectible in a certain sense, in that modernist sense, works that are so outside the system that they cannot be bought or sold so easily. They're not wanted. They are not commodities, which of course was one of the great impulses of land art, as Alexis's talk about Heiser demonstrated, this idea of getting outside of the, quote, system. But the 60s and 70s, we know, is also the beginning of the present, the beginning of the contemporary, the beginning of a kind of moment or period that we are now in where everything can be commodified and collected. And the contemporary is the ultimate commodity, the desire for the new and the escalating prices that we're all so conscious of. If you will, begins with pop and begins with an art of Warhol and Lichtenstein, which collectors like the Skulls and others were buying at the moment. And so the 60s is not just this pure period of outsideness and radicality, it's also the beginning of our contemporary moment where everything can be bought. And perhaps what is uncollectible now is art that's just so expensive that nobody can afford it. That's the uncollectible today, including the institution where I work. So I wanted to just contextualize that and to think also about the history of gallerists like Vollard and Durand-Ruel and Kahnweiler and Peggy Guggenheim, and to think about Virginia Dwan and Robert Scull and Ileana Sonnabend, and perhaps Heiner Friedrich, one of the founders of DIA, as interesting figures. They are dealers, they are collectors, and they are patrons. They sort of blur those boundaries between collecting, commissioning, and selling in that period. I also wanted to make a distinction between different kinds of uncollectability. So there's the uncollectability of the earthwork, which is land-bound, which cannot be moved, which is not nomadic, as Rosalind Krauss would say modernist sculpture was. It could move around, it could be bought and sold. The earthwork is bound to its place. It's what came to be called site-specific. It was unmovable and therefore unexchangeable. It could not take on what Marx called exchange value. It couldn't be moved around and bought and sold. But there are different kinds of uncollectability that you'll see in the Dwan history that precede the earthwork. The earthwork might be the most radical or far out of the uncollectible of that period, but you'll see monochrome paintings that are now very prized that nobody wanted. You'll see works with outrageous subject matter, like Ed Kienholt's, which nobody wanted. So what is uncollectible changes at different times. And it's not just a question of the earthwork and its radical placement. There are other forms of uncollectibility. And my last point before we move through Virginia's history is to say that the earthwork comes at the end of a history of uncollectibility for Virginia Dwan, that she ran her gallery for just 11 and a half years. She starts it in fall of 59, and she closes it in June of 71. And most of what she showed, many of which is now prized, didn't sell. And the gallery ran at a loss year after year after year. And ultimately, Ms. Dwan had to shut the gallery because it was a losing proposition. And it's only because she had private wealth, as you heard. She was an heiress to the 3M company. Her grandfather was one of the co-founders, that she could kind of fund her operation and support her artists, which she deeply believed in doing. But she lost money year after year. And so it's very interesting to think about the fact that the earthwork is coming at the end of a history of her gallery of things that didn't sell. So the Dwan Gallery you heard starts in Los Angeles in a small gallery, and she starts off at a certain point showing abstract expressionist painting. Franz Klein, Philip Guston. She's coming east quite a bit to scout out artists and artworks. It's interesting to think, by the way, of this period as a period of mobility, of transportation, of the jet airplane, reducing the time of flying between the coasts or between the East Coast and Europe, allowing for artists and dealers and collectors to move around in a way that is utterly and tediously familiar to us today. We who schlep around to art fairs, whatever we do, that's really kind of beginning in this moment. And this period of the bi-coastal art world of LA and New York, and Virginia having perhaps the first bi-coastal gallery with outposts in New York and LA, emerging in this period of transportation, which of course makes possible land art itself. Right, all the flying and the helicoptering and getting to the Earthworks, driving down the highway, which of course the highway system in the United States is developed by President Eisenhower in the mid to the late 50s and the 60s. So there's a whole history of transportation underlying this period as well, and this exchanges of goods and ultimately the creation of the earthwork. So just look at these incredible shows. Franz Klein and Philip Guston, they had to be shipped to Los Angeles. Air freight was expensive. These things generally didn't sell. The Yves Klein show, just imagine, she brings Yves Klein to America in '61 with Castelli, starts off the show at Leo Castelli, then he comes to Los Angeles, very different shows. And he makes sponge paintings in the back of her house in Malibu on the beach. None of these things sold. So monochrome paintings were unsellable. Reinhardt's were unsellable. And just imagine, Rauschenberg combines. What would this installation be worth today? One of the things I would have asked Virginia to talk about is the wonderful Rauschenberg first landing jump on the right, which was in her show. She tried to sell this, so nothing sold, and she sent this to Texas, and hopefully some people would buy it in Texas, and nobody bought it in Texas. And ultimately, Philip Johnson bought it and gave it to MoMA, where it is today. So that was the only thing that sold, and it sold after. I don't think she made the money for it. I think it was sold maybe by Castelli in the end. The second Dwan gallery, she opens, she designs it with an architect. It's much bigger. And what you're seeing is an increasing scale in art. Suzanne Boker showed us the show Scale as Content at the Corcoran in 1967. Remember the big X by Ronnie Bladen. So the scale of art, thanks to abstract expressionism, minimalism, and so on, is enlarging in this period and making the work unsellable as well. Like, whose home will these, you'll see some very large works fit into. Brings the French New Realists, like Armand. Does one of the first pop shows, My Country 'Tis of Thee. She doesn't particularly love the title, but she came up with it. And shows Marisol and Lichtenstein and Oldenburg, all this stuff in 1962. One of the first pop shows. Martial Race, one of the French New Realists. Hollywood people visiting the gallery. But as Ms. Dwan will tell you, there were only 6 collectors in Los Angeles in this period, and a lot of them didn't buy anything. So just think of the Los Angeles art world today, how big it is, how capitalized, how different it was then. Oh, I couldn't forget. The first Brillos were shown at Dwan Gallery, made for a show called Back Boxes that her director, John Weber, organized. He had come from the East Coast, from Martha Jackson Gallery here in New York, and knew Warhol and Rosenquist, and so a wonderful show of boxes, many of them pop, but also Cornell and Nevelson historical works were in this show. First show of Oldenburg on the West Coast. He comes west with Patty Oldenburg, and He had had this show at the Green Gallery, the famous gallery organized by Dick Bellamy, funded by Robert Scull, as you heard. And some of these things were shipped to LA, like the ice cream cone. But a lot of things were made in situ in Los Angeles, a vinyl, a whole new material that we now associate with him. Those works were first made in Los Angeles by Patty in collaboration with Klaus. Unsellable content, Keenholt's backseat Dodge, young kids having sex in the back of a car. Who's going to buy that? In fact, the police department, the LAPD, was contacted about this work, and policemen came and took photos and documented this show, and it was only Tom Bradley, the future mayor, who was a city council person, who got Virginia out of this mess. Opens her gallery in '65 in 57th Street, her New York gallery, with Keenholtz's Beanery, this sort of remarkable, as you know, installation depicting, realizing, if you will, at three-quarter scale, Barney's Beanery, a restaurant in West Hollywood. Minimalism meets Saul LeWitt, likes his work. He introduces her to Smithson, to Carl Andre. The next thing, the wonderful show called 10, October of '66. Reinhardt, who she'd showed, advises her. Agnes Martin is in the show. All these incredible things. Most of them didn't sell. The question of scale, so the bigness of land art that we know about, well, already again, some of the sculpture is getting so large that she has to make a big hole in the roof of her Westwood gallery to fit this de Souvero. Paula Cooper just showed it not so long ago in 2010, showing us the difference in the scale of contemporary galleries, which now can hold this kind of art easily. But in 1965, even the large Dwan gallery could not hold this de Souvero. Whole room installations, Carl Andre's cuts, or a group of Bob Morris sculptures. Nobody bought these things. I find it sad as a lover of this art. It saddens me, but anyway. And the language shows really the first conceptual art shows in a gallery. These things may be for $500 or $200. You could buy something now very prized. Some things sold, a lot of things didn't. So it's interesting to think about land art and conceptualism as absolutely dialectically intertwined, the extreme materiality and bigness of land art emerging simultaneously with the dematerialization and the ephemerality of radical, paper-bound, textual conceptual art. So land art, here we are, beginning with trips, the Pine Barrens non-site that Alexis showed, beginning with trips undertaken, led by Smithson and Holt with their friends, people like Morris and Carl Andre and Virginia along for the ride. The Earthworks, the first show of land art, was at Dwan Gallery with the dirt pile of Bob Morris. You can now see it up at Dia. Occurring simultaneously with the first Earth Room, which you heard about. That was at Munich, at Heiner Friedrich's gallery, also in October of '68. And it's interesting to consider what happens to the collector, okay, and what happens to the dealer. So we saw Robert Scull flying around in helicopters to see the displacements. Well, here we have Virginia accompanying Smithson and Holt on that very famous trip to Florida, to the west coast of Florida, where they bury the upside-down tree of Smithson, or then they go on to the Yucatan, and Smithson makes the 9 mirrored displacements. Ephemeral works, works that are not going to last, that we only remember photographically, or which decay as the tide comes in over time. Virginia has a great story, which I'll just share for a second. It happened at this non-site, the 9th one. the ninth mirror displacement, along the Usumacinta River in the Yucatan, where Virginia got out of her this boat, and Bob and Nancy Smithson Holt had gone up there to make this mirror piece that you see in the bottom right, and they abandoned Virginia, and it was quicksand. You can see it's quicksand, and Virginia Dwan was abandoned there. And it was really, really hot, too. It's the Yucatan in the spring. And so the question of experience, of the dealer and collector having experiences, you're buying an experience, that sort of came up with Alexis's talk, is really interesting to think about. So now the great earthworks that Virginia Dwan commissioned. A few points. Double negative being the first. I believe Alexis will correct me, but I think it was it $29,000 or $39,000 to build and buy the land? It was in the mid five figures. 27. Thank you, Suzanne. So $27,000. I mean, to do this. And so, okay, that's a lot of money in 1969, but in the larger scheme of things, in a period that we now live in of hyperproduction, of insanely expensive commissions, of fetishized productions, Jeff Koons's and so on, just imagine the amount of art you could buy for $20-something thousand. So there's a different sense, although these are wealthy people, you could get a lot for your money, if you will, even though you're not going to be able to sell this thing. So that's the hook. Another thing I wanted to bring up is, see, it was owned by Ms. Dwan, gift of Virginia Dwan to MoCA. And a really interesting question about this work is, how does somebody own it? What happens to the ownership of the work? So she did own the double negative, and she gave it to MoCA, where it is today. But look at Spiral Jetty. So that's now, of course, in the Dia collection, but Smithson and Holt retained the ownership of Spiral Jetty. And then Nancy Holt gave it to Dia. So that's an interesting question to think about, is sort of in terms of collecting this uncollectible work, who ends up owning it and why? Then we might think about the long-term nature of this work, that, okay, you can build double negative in a few months, and the jetty happened in the spring of '70. But what about a project like the city complex of Heiser that is begun, conceptualized in the early '70s, and is still being completed? The longue durée of patronage for some of these works. This is City Complex 1 on the left. I believe Virginia covered that piece, and she's contributed to this project over the years, but so have many others. And so there's different sort of categories of patronage, and according to the time it takes to finish certain things. The lightning field, the very famous lightning field owned by Dia, completed in 1977, 300 20-foot poles in New Mexico, 1 kilometer by 1 mile in length. Well, there was a first lightning field, in fact. It's called the 5-pole lightning field that Virginia commissioned. It was put on the land of the Tremaines, the famous collectors Burton and Emily Tremaine. It was in Arizona, and it was ultimately disassembled. But that's one of her accomplishments as well, was to commission the first lightning field. And then Star Axis by Charles Ross, that extraordinary piece in New Mexico you saw pictures of, which is conceived by Charles in '71, formally starting to be built in '76, and is, I believe, about to be completed. In fact, Charles Ross is here this afternoon, and we might ask him about when Charles, you're going to finish Star Axis. But Virginia has supported this all these years. And finally, and I guess I'm about out of time, I wanted to sort of think about the legacy, or how it's happening now. How is land art being commissioned now? So we're focusing in this event on these sorts of grand moment of land art and these particular patrons like Robert Scull and Virginia Dwan. But well, how is land art funded today? Because in fact, there's a lot of it happening. Is an interesting question we might think about. The High Desert Test Site Park in Joshua Tree. Andrea Zattel, the artist, starts, and many artists make projects there. This beautiful one by Sarah Vanderlip only had about a 3-year duration. Or what is it for an artist like Ugo Rondinone to be commissioned by the Art Production Fund to make this extraordinarily large and expensive project, the 7 Magic Mountains? I don't know the exact figures, but I think it cost a lot more than the double negative. And what's it like to have a project like Desert X? The exhibition that has now formalized land art as a category of exhibition, where you go to Palm Springs and you can drive around and see commissioned works outdoors. So it's become a curated concept in a particular site, collaboration with particular curators. That's pretty much what I have to say, and we'll talk more about this in the discussion. Thank you.